being here. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us on such an important subject, such as anxiety and addiction. And we have one of the greatest experts in the field, Lloyd, who's with us tonight to answer any questions that you may have. So welcome, Lloyd. Thanks for being with us. I know Lloyd has a busy schedule, juggling a lot of things, but he sees the value and the importance on this subject matter. So we're going to pick his brain a little bit tonight and find out some strategies, and hopefully you can walk away with some great tools to be able to use, if not for yourself, if maybe for a colleague, a family member, or someone in your community. So I have some questions that I've laid out for Lloyd, and we're just going to go through them. And if we could ask the participants just to hold off till the end of the questions, and then we will allow opportunity for answers. So the very first question, Lloyd, I want to ask you is, can you describe the common triggers of anxiety that may lead individuals to turn to drugs or alcohol as a coping mechanism?
Yeah, absolutely. So with any mental health, and especially anxiety, and even just people having challenges with or without diagnosis and using substances, self-medication is one of the more prevalent and long-standing problems. So with anxiety, it can start in many ways. It's sometimes gradual. So you might say have a bad day at work, bad day with your boss, some negative experiences, and then the idea gets in your head, you're like, well, something's not working. I'm going to try something different. Right. And that's a very excellent strategy, but sometimes it's negative. So some people might say, well, you know what, I'm going to try drinking and just take the edge off.
Right. Yeah.
So sometimes it might happen there's many theories, but some of the major ones are that it might happen gradually. So then once you reach this boiling point of stress, then other coping strategies like self-medication with alcohol or drugs begins. Sometimes it's also a critical incident though. Right. So you could have something very, very serious, and you could have, say, a death in the family, you could have some sort of loss, you could have some sort of social anxiety and a trigger. And then the critical incident makes a trigger for alcohol or drugs. The dangerous part, especially with any mental health and addiction, is that addiction not only is self-medicating, but not only do I often take away fear or pain, I take away negative emotions, but then the drugs or alcohol often give you a substitute high or a good feeling. So you can see why with mental health and co-occurring disorders, that's often mental health and addiction in tandem.
Yeah.
They often go hand in hand. Addiction is not usually alone. It's usually with anxiety, depression, something along those lines, or vice versa. Right.
Okay, good.
So
thank you. Thank you for that. And I just hope that you can hear us. I'll try and speak a little bit louder, because we're sort of sitting back from the screen. I truly believe that there is a lot of times people will use, not with the intent to become addicted to the drug, but just as Lloyd said, to just take that edge off. And then as our bodies work, we need more and more of that substance to get that natural feel-good feeling. So thank you for that, Lloyd. The second question is, I've always wanted to ask this from you, is what are some early warning signs that someone's anxiety is actually leading them towards substance abuse?
So the number one trigger for any substance use or abuse or even introduction is being unable to deal with negative emotions, which all of us have challenges with, right?
Yes.
And so once more, it's about coping. So the big book in AA, they suggest stuff like HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, or dealing with being upset, hungry, angry, or upset. And sometimes people even add in sick. So if you find that you are hungry and angry, or you're isolating, or you're lonely or tired, or sometimes you're staying in your bed for a day or two, you're not getting out, but that is a cue to action to try to get some help and start moving forward, whether it's whatever's working for you, whether it's talking to friends, talking to sponsors, talking to your OCD coach, talking to
so even just the basic signs that we might not even be aware of or recognize. And I love that Lloyd used an acronym, because when you say, was it HALT, you said? HALT. And because I don't remember things very well, so often I'll try to attach an acronym to it. So that's really good way of describing it. And then the next question is, what are the most effective strategies? And I'm looking away from the camera because I'm referring to my notes. I always have notes. So so what are the most effective strategies for managing anxiety without resorting to drugs or alcohol? So we know what some of the signs are now. How can we use more healthier coping mechanisms?
For sure. So sometimes self-monitoring is a very good way. So like checking in, how am I doing today? 1 out of 10, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
say you are realizing you're a 4 or a 3, you're at a
Yes.
lower number,
Yeah.
then that might be a way to self-monitor that you might be triggered into using
Okay.
drugs and
Mhm.
alcohol. Other things with self-monitoring though is like, to be honest, realize that you're not broken. A lot of people think
Mm.
they are in some way,
Mhm.
shape, or form, and they don't realize what they're doing is working in their everyday life.
Mm.
And so sometimes we get fixated on something
Mhm.
that's not working as compared to what is working. So let's
Yes.
pretend you didn't go out today due to your anxiety, but you
Mhm.
probably still woke up, you showered, you changed,
Yes.
you. And so unfortunately, anxiety and depression, other symptoms get worse once we shoehole ourselves.
Yes.
So I didn't do this one little thing. So
Yeah.
now I'm down on myself. Well, I've
Mhm.
ruined my life. So now
Catastrophic
let's
thinking,
go
right?
drinking. Yeah. Or
Yes.
let's take the
Okay.
edge off. Or since I'm just gonna go anyway, because I've ruined everything.
Yeah.
And we forget to A, self-monitor, or B, recognize that a lot of the stuff we're doing is already working in our life. So if you really want to cope well, if it's working, do it some more.
Oh,
So
yeah.
even if you didn't go out that day or something happened,
Yes.
you still have all these other successes that you
Yeah.
have to continue. So you don't
Mhm.
shoehole yourself into this
Bet.
that
Yeah.
problem. But also if it's not working, change it, but
Yeah.
change it gently, but change
Mhm.
it lightly. So if today didn't
Nice.
work, then go out for a walk and see
Mhm.
how that works for you, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll eventually find strategies that you're doing every single day that works for coping.
Yes, then it would become second nature.
Yeah.
You know, when you said that about even change something, I was doing some research, and research has shown that if you change your immediate environment, even for like 10, 15 minutes, like you said, leave the house and go for a walk, your brain is able to transform, and your mindset shifts too. So I just thought of that when you mentioned that. I love it. Okay, so we'll carry on. We have some other questions that have come in, and also that I wanted to ask. Um, Now, I know that you have a lot of years, 17 years of experience in this field as not only addiction counselor, but a crisis intervention um, counselor and suicidal prevention. Those three are beautiful. Those three combined, you must have helped a lot of people over the years. I'm absolutely certain of that. So having said that, can you share some real life examples for our audience so that maybe they can identify a little bit clearer on individuals who have struggled with anxiety and substance use, and what lessons that can we learn from their experience? Maybe just one or two that stands out for you. I'm sure you have many.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so I guess some of the bigger ones, and there's lots of theories on how to do these things and what to
Okay.
do, but I
Mhm.
guess like taking risks. And what I meant by that is taking calculated risks. So if something's not working for you,
Uh-huh.
you have the status quo, right?
Okay.
And so the status quo might be not going out, it might be not meeting people, it might be drinking. But once you take risks, there's a new status quo, right?
Okay.
And so once you get away from the familiar, the status quo, the new familiar is what's beneficial for you.
Oh.
So way outside of the box, let's pretend I have an individual that's a female that has social anxiety and they're in an abusive relationship and they're drinking.
Okay.
Leaving the partner is way too scary. They're like, what will I do though?
True. Yeah.
And I can't leave. And I'm like, I'll have to go on welfare. And they're a provider, I'll have nothing. And I'll have to do a new school. And I'll have to do all these things. But once you leave and you go to a new school and you're on your own and you're independent,
Uh-huh.
it becomes less scary and that becomes the new status quo.
Mm.
And the new status quo becomes familiar. So if you can live with being in anxiety and being in an abusive relationship,
Mhm.
why can't you live a happier life with something being better? And the
Mhm.
real problem is that we hug the problem sometimes and stay in the status quo.
Mhm.
But if we take a risk,
Mhm.
the new better behavior will be our new status quo.
Mhm.
So if you take anything that you've changed, like so you didn't like your job, you take a risk on a new job,
Right.
that becomes the
Yeah.
new status quo
Yeah.
and the new familiar
Yes.
that you're capable
Yeah.
of dealing with. I'm
Right.
going to tell you the truth, if you can deal with your anxiety and still be relatively functional or deal with abuse
Yes.
or addiction,
Yeah.
you're an incredibly strong person.
Yes.
So now that you're going to be offered a better life,
Mhm.
how come you can't do it.
Yeah,
You can, but you
yeah.
have to take the risk.
And it's having the confidence to take the risk, especially if the situation you described, people lose their confidence. They feel codependent on that other person. They feel maybe they've been told they'll never make it alone. So
Yep.
it's a matter of taking that risk. And I always tell people lean into the discomfort. I know it sounds easier than we're explaining it. Like it sounds easy the way we're explaining it, maybe to some of you listening, but I know it can be very scary too, right?
Yep.
But I love that example. Over time, you can see it as a new.
As the new norm and the
Yeah.
new familiar, right?
Yes, yeah,
And it's interesting because that's what I mean. Like, even with addiction, for example, like if I give you all the negative things, well, I'm getting divorced, there's violence in my life, I'm getting broke, my boss is gonna fire me.
right.
And I give you, well, what would it look like without addiction? Wow, I'd probably be in a good relationship, I'd have a good job, I probably wouldn't have my mental health that's popping up from addiction or as a result with addiction.
Right,
So the life is already better, then why aren't we doing it? Right?
yeah,
And if you can make this the normal and
Yeah.
survive, you
Yeah.
can make the better life the normal and survive.
Yeah.
You just have to learn to take the
yeah,
risk.
you have to learn it, yeah, and be able to implement it next.
Yeah.
And having you as a counselor and having you as a person to see it more objectively, like I always say, it's hard to see ourselves. It's hard to see the picture when we're in that frame. I know for myself, living with anxiety for years and depression and OCD, there was like my brain automatically went to the negativity because it was so programmed. It was conditioned to go to the negativity, right? But what Lloyd's saying is wonderful because there is hope and optimism in it being able to do that. But I think a lot of that you need somebody in your arena to help guide you, like yourself, a counselor or someone that is
Absolutely.
educated in the field.
Or have a very high level of self-monitoring,
Mm,
but a counselor can teach you to have a high level of
yes,
self-monitoring.
that's it.
Like even going towards negativity and our general strategies for coping, like I said, that's our status quo, right?
Yeah.
So we might have 20 good things happen, and then we're like, well, my life
Yeah.
is ruined. I had a fight with my partner.
Yeah,
Well, didn't you do all these other things, like
Yeah.
20 things today that are good,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so having the ability to highly self-monitor and then gravitate towards the unknown.
Yes, yeah,
Excuse me, I got
yeah,
tickle in my
that's
throat.
okay. Do you need water?
Oh, I'm great,
Or-
thank you.
So again, when you were mentioning that, I just thought of as a coping strategy for some of you listening, and that can identify maybe with what we're talking about. Journaling is such a great way to bring that forward, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I often would tell the patients, I worked as a psych nurse for 29 years, and I would recommend to journal, and they would say to me, why would I journal? I have no motivation to write in a book or talk about my feelings. But when they started to do it, they were able to reflect back and see
100%.
every day, like maybe last week at this time, you were not, do you remember last week when you were admitted to the psych unit? You weren't able to get dressed. You weren't able to do your activities of daily living or even make it to the breakfast table.
Yep.
And now look at you, you're dressed, your hygiene, like you're being able to do your hygiene and eat and like, but when we're in that state of mind, including myself, you don't see the small progress. It's small progresses that make, as that saying goes, I always remember the saying that someone taught me, that small hinges swing big doors.
That makes sense, yeah, cool.
So I thought of that when you were talking and we were talking. So thank you, Lloyd, for that. The next one, I'm going to just ask you, ask you, how can one differentiate between occasional substance use? Because as we talked earlier, that it starts out just maybe in social settings, in social realms, and then we start drinking or using in our home by ourselves. So what are some of the telltale signs that when one can differentiate between occasional substance use and a problem that now requires crisis intervention, or even maybe not even crisis intervention, but it's at the point where some form of intervention has to take place.
Yeah.
So what are some of the signs and symptoms?
For sure, there's whole volumes of
Yeah.
books written on that, like
Sure.
volumes and volumes. But some of the basics that I really keep in mind, especially for addiction and substance use,
Yeah.
that sometimes people forget that all abuse and use is not addiction, and not all addiction is use, right? So
Say that again.
not all use is addiction,
Okay,
and
yeah.
not all addiction is use,
Okay.
right?
I don't know if I understand the second
No
part.
problem. So like, if I have a beer occasionally, that is not necessarily addiction,
Okay.
right? But really how badly is your life being affected negatively?
Mm.
So I've met guys that I hang out with that are gym buffs, and that's the dangerous part about addiction. It's actually condoned and it's actually like
Mhm.
patted on the back, right?
Mhm.
Oh, you go to the gym 3 hours a day?
Mm.
That's amazing, right? But yet they don't have intimate relationships with people, and they ruin their home life. They're not able to maintain functionality with friends and family because they're always at the gym, right?
Okay. Mhm.
So like even things that are beneficial can be an addiction, right?
Mhm.
So like I've worked with couples and I'm like, so where's your boyfriend, girlfriend, or your husband?
Mhm.
Oh, he's at the gym. Well, isn't it important to be here, right?
Mhm.
Because we're trying to work together on
Right.
something. And they're like, well, no, they have to go to the gym at least 3 hours a day or they're not themselves.
Oh, okay.
So like even something positive. So not all addiction is use. It's not all
Mhm.
alcohol and it's not all drugs, but not all use is
Yes,
addiction. So
got
it could
it.
be other things like gambling, right?
Right.
Or other things like food
Yeah,
as an
for
example,
sure,
right?
yeah.
So
I'm glad you mentioned that because sometimes when we hear that word addiction, we automatically associate it with alcohol
drugs and
or
alcohol,
drugs. Yeah,
yeah,
I like that. I'm glad you
for
pointed
sure.
that out.
And so that's why the umbrella for me about addiction and between use and misuse and even addiction, right? So use, you just do it, and it
Mhm.
typically doesn't affect
Okay.
your life. Misuse typically is when you use something for a non-intended purpose, right? So if you're using something for a purpose, I'm drinking tonight to take my edge off.
Mhm.
That still doesn't mean addiction, but
Okay.
that's kind of the stopgap
Yeah,
measure in
okay.
between.
That's kind of bridging that
Yeah.
gap, like between where you're starting, where you may end up. Is
Yeah.
that is that my understanding?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
got it.
On a continuum, and then there's
Okay.
finally addiction. So addiction is usually prevalent in your everyday life. So all kinds of things are happening. You're usually having some kind of financial difficulties, right? So I've met people that have great jobs and they drink $100 to $200 in booze a week. Even if it's just at the bar, they get loaded at $100 a night just once a week.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that's positive or it works or it's good,
Mhm.
but they're like, wow, I need to get a second job. I'm not making enough money. So they could make ends meet, but their finances are being totally affected because of their drinking.
Okay.
So then maybe their social life is being affected, right? So wow, last week Lloyd got angry at me because he's so drunk that he started yelling for no reason, right? Or if it starts
Yeah.
isolating you, right?
Mhm.
Like people don't want to talk to you or you're too busy drinking.
Mhm.
A couple of the other things that I often keep in mind is what is your substance use of like, is it alone?
Mm.
Alone is not necessarily a trigger, but if you're misusing it alone, that's starting to get challenging. Or if you abuse it alone, it doesn't mean just because I drink at home a couple times or on occasion, but if I'm planning to get drunk at home alone, there might be a problem. I'm not saying there is,
Okay.
right?
All right.
Yeah, so misuse, and then finally, there's also amount of doubt, danger or breaking the law in many cases,
Mhm.
right? So I've met and known lots of people that think nothing about drinking and driving, and we all understand
Yeah,
that kills people, right? And
yeah,
that's against the law.
yeah.
So, and even sometimes people understand, like, even at the lake, I'm at the lake driving my nephew around that's 9 that is not in the right frame of mind to make decisions or protect themselves, right? So
Okay.
you're drunk
That's
whipping around on
true.
the quad, right? You're actually presenting some degree of danger.
Right.
Or even a client fell asleep with a smoke in their mouth with their house on fire because they passed out.
Okay.
That is when now there's a definite sign
Yes.
of potential addiction.
Right. Okay,
So
great. Thank you for lots of great examples in that. So I think we've covered a lot of grounds with what we've talked about. But the last thing, and I always try to incorporate this every time I have a guest speaker, is okay, now we know some of the signs and symptoms, but we also sometimes leave the family and loved ones in the background, and we don't pay attention to what those individuals can do to help support the person living with a potential addiction, um, addiction or substance problem. So is there any things that you want to add before we wrap things up, as far as if someone is listening and maybe their loved one's going through some things and they're thinking, maybe this is an issue, maybe we do have to seek some form of intervention?
yeah,
What are some of the recommendations you'd give family or loved ones or co-workers or employers?
absolutely. Two things that to think about.
Okay.
Addiction. So like there's a couple things that I want to touch on, but you mentioned
Sure.
it. So addiction is covered under mental health.
Okay.
So make no mistake, for employers, and I've had to write policies for organizations.
Right.
if someone discloses to you that I have an addiction, what can you do?
Okay.
They automatically qualify for your EAP. They
Okay,
automatically,
good to know.
they cannot be discriminated against.
Good.
It's like if I had cancer and I was like, boss, I have cancer, and they're like, well, you're fired.
Yes, yeah,
Right? Mental health and addiction is now covered,
okay,
first of all.
great to
So
know.
you can't be discriminated. And I'm gonna be honest, like addictions knows no bounds. It doesn't know race, it doesn't know creed,
No.
it doesn't know color, it doesn't know income, it doesn't know profession. At my college, for example, I had a colleague that I appreciated and they're falling asleep at work and I could tell is due to Percocet or opiate addiction. Like I could tell.
Mhm.
And I knew them from other colleagues, knew them from another college,
Okay.
and they were let go for that exact same reason. And so she sat down with me at my desk next to me, and she's like, "Oh my God, I'm gonna get fired from the college. I'm sure of it." And I'm like, "What's going on?" And she's like, "I'm constantly late, and the students have been complaining I'm falling asleep on them." And I was like, "It is not my job to judge you, all right?
Mhm.
But just so you're clear, addiction is covered if
Okay.
you need to go to an
Okay.
EAP." And she's like,
Right.
"What do you mean?" And I'm like, "I understand you may or may not have had a back injury. I understand you may have been using drugs to cope because you need it and are prescribed
That's
them.
right.
And I understand that you may be not in the best frame of mind to work potentially. I'm not trying to judge you or label you, but
Just possibility.
if you say that this is a problem, which may or may not be, then you are covered, right?
Okay.
So you cannot be discriminated for addiction, especially if you disclose it. Now, if you hide it and
Mhm.
don't tell them you're just consistently late for work and missing,
Yeah,
then it
that's a
is what it
different,
is,
yeah,
right?
well, that's good.
For family and friends, two things. This is the tough part. Don't enable them, right? We can't enable
Mhm.
people, but also don't control them because
Mhm.
controlling them has disastrous results too.
Mhm.
So I've seen families, so what you should do is seek professional advice or help, like myself, like someone else. And here's
Mhm.
why. What they do is they often say, well, that's it, I'm controlling your money.
Mm.
Well, then thinking that's going to work. Well, then what they do is they
Mm.
sell their personal furniture. Or what they
Yes.
do is they're like, I can't believe you're controlling my money. It's
Right.
mine. You know, it's in the best interest.
Right,
So trying to think that you're going to take control of this person isn't,
Yes,
it's going to
yeah.
actually lead to disastrous results
Mhm.
and put you further apart.
Right,
Right?
it'll agitate them too, much,
Absolutely.
very much so.
And fragment your relationship,
Right,
believe it or not.
yeah, good
Like it
point.
won't be seen as caring,
Right.
right? But also try not to enable them, right? Like it's
Mhm.
unfortunate. To some degree, people have that natural consequence. If they're too hungover to get to work, you shouldn't be driving them, right? Because that's
Mm.
part of the natural
Okay.
consequence on how people learn. So that it's gonna be tough, but they should seek professional
Yeah.
advice on how to A, not enable them,
Right,
but B, not negatively affect them by
Right.
projecting my
Yeah.
issues, that I'm angry or
Yes.
projecting my issues that you're not doing what I want you to,
right.
right?
And that's a hard, I can see how that would be really hard. And setting boundaries, like it's, a lot of it has to do with boundaries too. Would you agree? Like, it,
Yep.
or in the sense that it's that expression, sometimes tough love. And I've worked with clients where they've shared their stories about a loved one having an addiction and how that has impacted their OCD or made their depression worse or elevated their anxiety. And so it's really important that they get help as well. So thank
Absolutely.
you.
Yep.
That was great. Really want to thank you, Lloyd, for being here tonight. And we covered a lot of grounds. If you have any further questions or want some clarity or just want to have a bit of more in-depth conversation about what we talked about this evening, if it's impacting you and anxiety to some extent or depression, or maybe you have OCD as well, regardless of what you're going through or thinking about, make sure that you always know that there is a 15-minute consultation available to you through our website at www.theocdcoach.com. We have our email, it's info@theocdcoach.com. And as always, you can reach us by phone 204-295-4408. And as always, we will see you hopefully next month on the last Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. Just a friendly reminder, our Q&A that runs every month is always on the first Monday of the month. So if I do the work there, we're running into a long weekend. So our next Q&A runs on August 5th. On Monday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So thank you once again. And if there's no questions, we will say goodbye for now. And again, thank you, Lloyd. And we will meet you there. Bye for now.